We've just completed the networking portion of our service profile template configuration. Next, we need to look at all of the policies that we've already defined, and we just need to assign them appropriately within the service profile template. By the end of this nugget, we'll have finished the creation of our service profile template. Having completed the networking portion, we can click Next, and we find ourselves on SAN connectivity. Now in our environment, we're not deploying anything related to Fibre Channel, which is what this is. This isn't actually iSCSI yet. This is strictly Fibre Channel. So we are going to say no VHBAs in our situation, but in other environments, we might want to go to the Expert tab, just like we did with networking, and start to create virtual HBAs by clicking Add down here, and we can say FC0, assign the worldwide port names, assign the fabric, assign the vSANs, and we've created a virtual HBA. Again, in our case, we're just going to scroll up and say no VHBAs and click Next. Zoning would be if we had a Fibre Channel storage array directly attached to the fabric interconnects. Again, in our case, we don't have this, so we'll just say Next. Now, VNIC and VHBA placement, usually we're going to leave this alone and say let the system perform the placement. This is the order in which the VNICs and VHBAs are added to the bus. So we don't need to worry too much about that unless we have a very specific reason. But if we do have that reason, here's where we'd want to come and create a placement policy. In our case, we'll say Next again. vMedia would be if we want to automatically attach virtual media to the service profile, which we do not, so we'll say Next. And here's the first really interesting configuration section for this nugget. We're going to look at the server boot order. Now, when we expand this, we see all the boot policies that we've defined, including SD boot. This boot policy defines that we want to boot off of the SD cards, but as has been previously mentioned a few times, we want to start every boot policy out with a CD and DVD boot, because that allows us to interrupt the boot process simply by attaching virtual media, in many cases an ISO image, which would basically be like a virtual CD or DVD image, to the server. Now, if we scroll down, you might see that there are these grayed out buttons. These buttons will come into effect when we do the iSCSI boot process, but for SD boots, we don't have to worry about it. There's nothing else for us to do here, so we can simply click Next. Next up is maintenance policy, and we've already defined this, so we use the drop down, say user acknowledgement. That gives us exactly what we want for maintenance, and we click Next. Server assignment. So because it's a service profile template, we can't actually pick a specific server. We can only assign service profiles to servers, not templates. As such, we need to either say we'll assign it later, or we can assign it to a pool. Now, we've created this pool. It has a single server in it in our environment. In other environments, it'll usually have a lot more than that. But we'll assign this to a pool. That means that as soon as this service profile template creates a service profile, that service profile will be brought up on a server within that pool. Now, the server pool qualification takes that a step further and says, I'm going to look for a server in this pool that has this specific set of criteria matching it. So in our case, we have a policy that defines it has to have a minimum of 128 gig of memory. So we select that. Now it'll find a server in this pool. Again, our pool only has one server, but a server in that pool that has a minimum of 128 gig of memory. Now, this part's easy to miss. If we're not careful, we don't see that the firmware management is right here on this page. We have to expand it with the plus and pick our host firmware package, in our case, the 3.2.3a package that we defined, and this will assign the firmware level to the service profile. If we don't do this, then the service profile will just receive whatever version of firmware is currently on the hardware. And we don't necessarily want that because we might move the service profile from one piece of hardware to another. If that happens, we want to make sure that we take our firmware with it. That allows us to control the firmware in the environment, allows us to make sure that we upgrade firmware when we want to. It makes it a lot better to support because all of our servers are running the same firmware. Just best practice, make sure we assign a host firmware package to every service profile template we create. And with that, we say Next. And that brings us to kind of the catch-all, calls it operational policies on the left. It's all of the things that we don't really have a place for anywhere else. So it's quite a collection. First, we start with BIOS configuration. We didn't set a BIOS policy, so we're not going to set one here. But the two we do need to pay attention to, the management IP addresses, we want to make sure that we're pulling those from the external management IP pool that we discussed previously. Scrolling down a little ways, we want to come to the scrub policy. We'd create a scrub policy that says, hey, let's wipe the SD cards if the service profile is detached from the hardware. It's just good practice. So we're going to say scrub all. That's the policy we defined. And with that, we are done. We will say finish. So there we go. We've created service profile template ESXi-demo, and we can click OK. We did it! We created the service profile template. In some ways, it feels like that's the culmination of all the other UCS skills for those who have completed those. It's all been geared towards creating a service profile that will come from a service profile template. Now, we're not done yet, though, because we still need to create that service profile, assign it to a blade, and do an actual hypervisor install. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.